to me, is the ultimate goal of national security. And in this case, we're talking of comprehensive national security. In this, then, if you are not clear about this particular endpoint, no matter what we do, we are not going to reach it. Because sometimes we'll talk of one subset of national security, which is traditional. Sometimes we'll talk about the other, which is non-traditional. But to me, the first point is to have a crystal clear view as a policymaker on what we are trying to achieve. Once you're clear about that, then the next question is, how do you achieve this comprehensive national security? How do you make your average citizen secure physically, economically, and psychologically? And there, for Pakistan, I think the starting point is the availability of sufficient resources to be able to distribute fairly and judiciously among a very, very, very large population. And that's where we come to this concept of economic security that became sort of the core or the fulcrum of our national security policy that was approved in 2022. The problem there, very simply, is that Pakistan's national economic pie, the size of that pie is too small for a country that has responsibilities in terms of traditional security, given the region we live in, non-traditional security in terms of human welfare. On both counts, Pakistan is severely underfunded and under-resourced, both on the traditional security count and on the non-traditional or the human security element of that. So the struggle for Pakistan now is, number one, to increase the size of that national resource pie. If the size of the pie is as small as it is, i.e. the total net worth of Pakistan, then you will always have these competing interests and discord as different institutions, power centers, individuals try and usurp as much resources as they can for themselves. This is how the national pie should be distributed, but the size, the smaller the size, the more acrimonious those tussles are going to be. So there we started focusing on how do you get the size of the national economic pie to increase. And in Pakistan's case, it is really very simplistically put, how much foreign exchange can Pakistan bring into the country? We earn about $65 billion a year. We need to get to about 95 billion to sustain the current level of current expenditure, debt, etc. There you have basically two avenues to bring in foreign exchange. One is export, the other one is remittance. These are the two that will bring in more foreign exchange and then start increasing the size of the pie. The other opportunity you have is cost cutting. Sometimes we call it import substitution, but really, to my mind, the cost cutting that Pakistan has to focus on, and the only cost cutting Pakistan should focus on, is everything that dilutes the elite capture of the economy. So we keep talking about taxes and fiscal space and whatever, and we keep overtaxing. We are not an undertaxed, we're an overtaxed economy, but we're taxing a very small proportion of those who should be taxed. So what you've really got to think about is, how do you start cutting expenditures which are going into perpetuating the elite capture or the interest of that 1% of society. The second thing you have to do in terms of ensuring economic security, so one is getting more money into the country and then cutting expenditure. But the second thing is redistributing fairly. It's no good to have a larger economic resource pie, which is then again distributed only among the elite. And there, one, you have to redistribute from the rich to the poor. But the other one we don't talk enough about is that Pakistan has a serious problem of a lack of judicious distribution from the developed parts of the country to the underdeveloped parts of the country. Sometimes we call it the core and the periphery, whatever we want to call it, but we have to have better geographical distribution and then better vertical distribution from the rich to the poor. So that's essentially, in a nutshell, that's what I define, or we've defined, the comprehensive national security paradigm to be. Now, I'll take just 3 or 4 minutes and explain, in my view, how do you get there. So the very first thing we need is a change of mindset. If we are unable to move away from a structure of governance which tries to regulate and control rather than facilitate growth, we are not going to be able to make this transition. Second, if we are unable to think big and think new outside of the status quo, you are not going to get the change we are looking for. So you need people who are willing to think anew in terms of hurting some of the status quo, moving away from that. I'm not making any political statement here. This is just a completely technical sort of point that I'm making. And then think of facilitating those who are going to build the economy rather than regulating and controlling. That's number one, the mindset. The second thing is prioritization. My experience of government and many others who've done this much more than I do, at one time, you can only focus on so many things in terms of the public sector. We don't have the capacity to do 50 things well at the same time. So if you want to prioritize based on what I said earlier, number one, pick the 2 or 3 winners in terms of export. What are the export sectors that can allow you to leapfrog? Number 2, which are the countries that you should be targeting to send your labor, semi-skilled and skilled labor, to get the maximum return on remittances? Third, prioritize those elements of fiscal expenditure or cost cutting, as I said, which are going to dilute the elite capture. And fourth, prioritize your redistribution to underdeveloped parts of the country and to the poor. These are the 4 areas in big baskets that I would take if I were moving forward on this agenda of comprehensive national security. Third, you need to have a civil-military agreement. Consensus is a cliche term, but an agreement on the governance model which is built around economic security. I'm not saying who's right, who's wrong, how you do it, but whatever that is, that agreement is necessary to ensure policy continuity. You need a consensus in terms of course, the civilian leadership, and then you need a civil-military agreement. How do we ensure that the fundamental policy changes we bring in through the change of mindset and prioritization that I mentioned, those will continue for 10 years, 8 years, 15 years, whatever that longevity is required to institutionalize that particular change. Fourth, governance and management. How do you actually manage all of this, and how do you govern this particular change or this direction that I'm mentioning? For me, there are 3 things. First of all, you need to create a model where those who implement policy decisions, i.e. a civil service, have domain knowledge. We can no longer exist in a world that's specialized with a group of very good, very smart, bright generalists. Can't do that anymore. So you have to now marry your very good implementers who are the civil service today with experts brought in through either lateral entry or whatever mechanism you want to create, who will then be able to create modern policy after direction from the political masters and have them implemented through the current structure of the civil service. Second, you have to ensure that policy uniformity exists between the center and the provinces. And the body for that already exists, the Council of Common Interest. That has to become one of your strongest constitutional bodies if you want to ensure that there is a smooth implementation of directives across the country, all provinces and the center. And finally, one of the big changes you will have to see before you see responsive governance and the kind of redistribution I've talked about is strong local governments. Doesn't matter how good your federal and provincial tiers are. If your local governments are not empowered in terms of their fiscal responsibility, including revenue generation, you are not going to be able to do responsive governance in the long run. And finally, I think Pakistan will have to make one big decision. How do we want to manage our neighbors? Because if you want to go in a direction of economic security, one of our biggest drags, binding constraints in some ways, is the region that we exist in and the geopolitics around that region. Again, I'm not passing a judgment call on what's right or what's wrong, but I think we need a very clear consensus-based decision on how do we want to manage our neighbors, because that's holding back or not, depending on which side of the divide you're on, some of what we can gain in terms of the economy. That's essentially what I'll put on the table. The 2 that I want to just leave with you, I haven't mentioned because they're long-term and people say, well, now you're talking 50 years. Education ultimately has a human resource has to come through that long term, but even in the short run, the skills development part has to be focused on. And finally, population growth, because all our resources, water, climate, all that conversation starts and ends with the size of the population or the number of mouths you have to feed. So that, to me, frankly, is the national security or the comprehensive national security paradigm. It is not about who's right and who's wrong. It is about getting these fundamentals in place so that you have more money to spend both on traditional security and on non-traditional security while breaking the elite capture that doesn't allow us to get past the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moin, and right on time. You raised some of the very pertinent points, and I think what I got what the question is when we talk about the security, who's it for? We're talking about security for the citizens, when every citizen gets get a hold of basic human rights and basic. And then how we're going to do that, and then you talked about some of the things like a fundamental change in the approach, changing the lens, bringing some structural changes, and moving from traditional approach to non-traditional violence. The floor is open for questions. I think questions we'll take for Dr. Murray, and then we'll continue with our session. Identify yourself. The mic. Yeah, if you would like to say that, I don't know whether I can or I can repeat the question. Yeah, I can use that. Yeah, after I guess one question in the meantime, they will be fine. All questions.
Dr. Moin, Assalamualaikum. I'm Mr. General, National Institute of Maritime Affairs, MSA. So you talked about some big things which need to change, and towards the end you did that we need to change the way we are dealing with the management of our neighbors. Definitely, a lot of things are happening, but no regional connectivity is taking place at the moment in diplomatic terms. So, what's your take on this in terms of giving us a little guideline that what we should do principally, maybe one or two things? Thank you.
Should I respond, or will you take a group of questions?
It's up to you if you would like to, or you want to take all three questions.
Yeah, why don't we take 3 or 4 and then I can just answer so that you can continue with the panel after that. Not too well, frankly. पहले वाले साहब का बेहतर था आप, लेकिन वो रिपीट कर देंगे. I think डॉक्टर साहब अगर ना समझ आए. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Ji, I can.
Can you hear me now? Thank you very much for your very sharp, crisp, and to the point presentation. Incidentally, we were thinking on the same lines. I don't know why I clicked. When you made a recommendation for managing our neighbors, I quite often keep thinking that a country like us has 5 neighbors. That is China, Russia, Afghanistan, Iran, and India, of course. And unfortunately, we have not been able to manage our relations with all 5, or we have not been permitted to manage our relations. So what are those factors where we are not entirely independent for managing our relations with Afghanistan, with Russia, with China, with Iran, and people related. So would you please elaborate on those impediments or those obstacles of the international scene, which is not permitting us to be entirely independent to manage our finance? Thank you.
Last question, is there any, question?
What are the precise implications of change of this mindset from a regulator to a regulator?
Get the question right?
No, sorry, you'll have to repeat this last one.
You use two terms, facilitator and regulator, underlining the need to change our goals, change the role of the government from being a regulator to a facilitator. How does it translate into practical steps or measures for the change in mindset in terms of giving duty drawback, in terms of subsidies, in terms of our systems, the way we like one window of patients or whatever?
Sure.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So पहले दो सवाल of course region पे ही हैं. Let me just say that of course if it were that simple we would have done it by now. There are a number of complications in terms of the geopolitics around it, where we are situated. Two of our Western neighbors are isolated. We haven't isolated them, but there are reasons why the world has chosen, or the strongest parties of the world have chosen to do that. So it's very limited scope for business and cooperation there, at least on the economic side. There are security challenges that come from the entire Western border, so we have to deal with that. India, of course, we know the relationship, and we can sort of debate this till the cows come home, who's right and who's wrong. But the bottom line is, there's empirical evidence beyond any iota of doubt that regional integration does help all economies, small and large. So that's something that India and Pakistan have foregone given our relationship. That by itself doesn't mean that we immediately start doing it. But we have to think as a nation and come to a consensus on what we want to do. If we don't want to do that, then how do we offset that loss? That conversation, I think, has never been done plainly and openly, and we just need to figure out how to manage it. The negativity that comes from India, and it does, whether one likes it or not, I've seen it myself. How do we then mitigate that if the relationship is what it is? This is a conversation I think we need a consensus on. But this idea on who's stopping us and what, let me just put it very simply. I'm not sure what the angle to that question was, but my answer is very, very simple. There's only one thing that prevents Pakistan in this space from doing many things that we can do, and that is a weak economy. Our internal structures are weak because we have to go and beg for money every 31st of the month, unfortunately, colloquially put. You cannot have that space that you require. Now, there can be different governance styles and all of that, but fundamentally, we have to get our economy and our internal house in order if we want to be able to find that space that we are looking for. The chicken and egg here is that you need the world to a large extent to get the economy going again where we need to. So there has to be this kind of balancing act, but otherwise you will see, in my view, if we get our own house in order, much of the constraints that the world can put on us, we would be able to live without. In terms of the facilitation versus regulation, I think it's a good question. It's a longer debate, but one, I do think you need people and minds who are experts in their own fields who can come in and then create models and policies where you don't need to regulate all the time. Second, I think you have to change the incentive structure. A lot of people say, oh, the bureaucracy is this way or that way. Look, the bureaucracy is very good at what it does. They're rational actors who are pursuing the career incentives that have been put for them. If the career incentive is to regulate, control, and prevent anything from happening, then that incentive structure will continue making them regulate. So what we've really got to do is tie career paths to performance based on facilitation, based on outcomes, and not just outputs or inputs. I find that the Pakistani governance structure is very process oriented, not outcome oriented. So I think if you can tie incentives to outcomes, if you can tell a commercial counselor that your job is not to spend 3 years somewhere, your job is to get X amount of investment, I think you will start changing that conversation. I think that's frankly the direction we need to move in over time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murray, and
Thank you.
I'm sure that there must be many more questions there, but maybe some other time. Thank you, indeed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, we'll continue with our session. I now invite Dr. Christian Becker, who is an Asian Senior Fellow at Christian School of Politics. He will speak on promoting democratic values. Dr. Becker.
Good afternoon, everyone. The first question is always, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Let me start my clock to keep the time. First, let me thank the Institute for Regional Studies and Ambassador Rias for the kind invitation to participate in your conference today. It's a great pleasure to join you again, and I feel honored to be on this excellent panel. Let's hope that the next time we have more opportunities to meet in person and to discuss our topics here. Let me briefly do 3 points in the following. First, I will take a short look on South Asia in the general debate on democracy and development. Secondly, I would take a brief look at the decline of democracy in the region that we are seeing in different countries over the last couple of years. And finally, address some of the challenges, but also some of the prospects for promoting democratic values. First, when you look at the general debate about democracy and development, South Asia has always been an interesting test case. Why? Well, from the societal and from the economic structure of the countries in the region, they do not really seem to be fit for democracy, at least according to textbook knowledge. You all know that there is a high societal fragmentation along religious, linguistic, ethnic, caste, tribal lines, or other forms of social differentiation. It has already been mentioned that the state in South Asia is weak, institutions are weak. This is a well-known phenomenon. But we also have seen high economic growth rates. It has also already been mentioned by Moed Yusuf in recent debate, but we see little redistribution. So we see high levels of inequality and hardly any progress in development, especially when you look at the figures, for instance, of the Human Development Index of the United Nations. So this structure seems to run counter the classical understanding of modernization theory, but I think there's also, or this is the very astonishing part, that we have seen in the region numerous changes of governments by democratic elections, and we also have data from surveys like the South Asia Barometer that show that there is a high degree of support for democracy in the region. What is especially noteworthy is that these data shows that you have the highest support, especially among the marginalized groups in society. And South Asia seemed also to have a common democratic future when the SAARC passed its Charter of Democracy at the Thimphu Summit in 2011. But this in this period, nearly all South Asian countries, at least if I remember correctly, at least had some formally elected democratic governments. Also, the quality, of course, differed very much. But unfortunately, these hopes for a more democratic South Asia have been short-lived. And this brings me to my second point, the decline of democracy in the region and the decline, of course, is very similar to trends we have seen on the global level. The reasons are manifold and are, of course, a mix of different international and national developments. On the international level, yes, of course, we have all struggled with the pandemic and its effects on our societies. One should also keep in mind that the pandemic has also strengthened the executive power in many countries. So we have also seen a certain tendency to foster autocratic tendencies. With the recent attack of Russia, we have seen the sharp increase in food and energy prices, which of course on a global level have affected especially poorer countries. When you look on the national level within the region, and I will restrict myself here only to the 5 larger countries, I think we have seen a rise of populism and autocratic tendency in very different degrees. There is not a uniform picture. When you look more closely, I think it seems that these national developments seem to follow a certain past dependency in the respective countries. But of course, there are also some similarities in the developments. We've seen an attack and a weakening of institutions. We see restriction on press and media freedom, and we have also seen a lot of restrictions on civil society in the different countries. If we shortly look at some of the countries in the region, I mean, the most dramatic change happened in Afghanistan with the takeover of the Taliban last year in 2021. I think we can all agree that the situation is a political, economic, and humanitarian disaster with enormous repercussion on its neighbors, especially on Pakistan, where you have seen a massive rise in terrorist attacks and border clashes since then, as far as I can follow the developments in your country. In Pakistan, as has already been mentioned, the debate centers very much on the role of the military. It was quite interesting to see General Bajwa's confession last November that the army should remain apolitical in the future, and I think it remains to be seen in how far this is going to happen. As was mentioned by Moed Yusuf, I think there is a need for a consensus between the armed forces and the political parties on the model of governance in the future. In India, we have also seen an enormous push for Hindu Rashtra, especially after the elections of 2019 or the re-election of Prime Minister Modi and the BJP. We have seen attacks on minorities. We are also seeing attacks on state structures. Federalism in India is also under enormous stress. We have seen in Sri Lanka the autocratic tendencies with the re-election of the Rajapaksa family. And even despite the recent political changes after the default, I think it's not really clear how the future of the democratic system in this country should be. We have also seen similar tendencies in Bangladesh. When you are following the debate over there, you know that the ruling Awami League has also strengthened its grip over the political system in recent years. So this brings me to my third point, promoting the democratic values. I think from the overview, it's obvious that promoting democratic values seems to become much more difficult. I think in the future, the focus will have a much stronger focus on the domestic political arenas. I think we may see less support from abroad, from Western countries. Simply Western countries either deal with the Ukraine war in Europe, or we deal with the challenges of a rising China in different parts of the world. So I think a lot of foreign policy thinking goes in this direction. And of course, you also have then the problem that the geopolitical interests may also dominate political considerations. On the national level, I think we have seen, and this of course is also a challenge, more executive powers by the government to control information flows. We have seen the restrictions of NGOs, and even when you think that in South Asia, you had a lot of transnational institutions linked to the SARC process, I think even the regional exchange is becoming much more difficult because of the travel restrictions. What may also be a new development is that there seems to be a tendency to criticize the international indices. We have seen this in India. We can also expect new models or more new models of democracy, understanding of democracy, fostered by cultural deliberations. We have seen similar developments in the past. Think about the basic democracy in Pakistan in the late 1950s, or the Panchayat system in Nepal in the 1960s. So I think it could be a possibility that these developments are coming again. So coming to the last point to end on a positive note, yes, democracy in South Asia is in decline, but I think for very different reasons. But one should also be clear that it's not necessarily in decline because people still have a strong belief in democracy. So when you look at the data of the South Asia Barometer, there seems to be the irony that people have a much better understanding of democracy in contrast to those segments of the political elite which prefer an autocratic model. The populist rule, we should always keep in mind, depends on the personality and the leader, but democracy, of course, depends on the ballot. And we have seen many instances where democratic elections have changed political constellations fundamentally. We have also seen setbacks for autocratic rule. Think about Sri Lanka, think about your own country in Pakistan, but also in India, we have seen these developments. So even if the short-term view may be difficult, I'm still optimistic on the promotion of democratic values in South Asia in the long-term perspective. So thank you very much for your patience. Madam Chair, I can't hear you at the moment.
Okay, we'll continue with our session, and thank you all for taking it now. Okay, and I'm sure that there will be questions, many more questions because of your stimulating talk. And one of the things that you raised, and I think the point that comes again and again about democracy is democracy cannot be blamed for the government's incompetence. So whether the governments, they're not being, if they have not been able to deliver, whether the concept of democracy, the way the items of democracy, whether we should blame them or not, and it's the illiberal democracy, perhaps that's the issue, and not really the core values that one can take for. So we'll have a discussion, and we'll invite you to respond to some of the questions, and I'll move to our third speaker, I invite Dr. Ahmed Ijaz Malik, Assistant Professor at of Politics and International Relations at Calcutta University, to speak on conflict management and economic development. Okay.
I'd like to thank you for inviting me to the talk. I think to begin by focusing on my topic, conflict management and economic development. The broader theme of that South Asia, but the theme of traditional conflict that's South Asia. In order to focus on what I want to say, and I'm beginning very briefly by explaining conflict, transformation, management, its relation to development. I'm going to briefly explain some of the traditional conflict models for the session on political basis. And I looked at you by asking a primary question whether there is any model which we can state South Asian states have followed. And then I'm going to focus on some of the major states in South Asia, which are very much relevant to Pakistan, and see whether there are any commonalities in the way they develop their economic model. And in the final part, I'm going to boil all of those down, few things which Pakistan can do, and which perhaps may lead to economic development in Pakistan, and perhaps kind of interaction of economic nature with its neighbors, which would be beneficial overall. So, looking at conflict management, it basically began as an idea of seeing conflict as there and trying to manage it in order to reduce the risk of war. Conflict resolution, another thing which the late 90s was large to minimize those risks actively by preventing related violence. And then we see another aspect of conflict transformation, where there is the idea of trying to get on with both areas where states can cooperate, while keeping the idea that conflict is there and trying to capitalize on the energies that was out of conflict was cooperation. A very ambitious idea with that. And the final theme which we see evolving the late 2000s is transcending conflict, trying to focus on common interest, which perhaps, as a game theoretical model may suggest, actors in conflict would set for themselves, and despite conflict, they try to work together to achieve their goals. So we see all of these playing very much as we see the relation China, Pakistan, Iran, and Iran, China, and Iran, India. So coming to this explanation, finally, suggesting what will be the chances of transcending conflict and connecting that to economic. Economic models, basically, economists, I'm not going to delve into those models. Economists would know, began from classical, neoclassical, Ricardian, Keynesian. Now we're supposed to be in a critique of those Marxian and socialist model. China obviously began as a very socialist state from 48 onwards, very systematically started transforming its model. So the nature of economic development that China had was focusing very on micro, absolutely transforming their energy sector and giving incentives to those with village-based and project industry. China Model 1, 2, 3 basically focused on channelizing their energy, their resources, set up and safely cooperate challenges. A focus from the macro, but specifically to micro economic perspective. India has had some kind of influence of socialist models of the economy, but very systematically in the past 10, 15 years, we developing a very strong neoliberal platform. Pakistan from the 1947 onwards to I'd say till 1990s showed a very good economic growth alleviation of poverty because its models were primarily based on targeting the micro economic indicators.
One phase which we saw was the rise of Islamic socialism, J. Rahim, just an episode of suggesting Islamic socialism, with it's just one term used, socialism as our economy, but we do not see any type of actual policy making to public ownership to bring about any type of revolutionary reform. One thing which we see mentioned by the president as well was Bhutto's, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's primary compulsory education. But we do see from then onwards, especially when we see the war on terror, a huge amount of a transition where Musharraf's regime is very systematically trying to introduce some kind of privatization, some kind of getting loans from IMF and trying to bring about changes which are at the macro level. The debt had piled up quite a bit by then, and we're seeing very systematically a kind of an effort to increasing exports. Now, I can use those terms as circular account deficit to be changed with circular account and credit account surplus, credit account deficit to credit account surplus. But basically, what we're trying to say is that all of these regimes from Musharraf onwards, Zardari, Muslim League, and PTI, were trying to develop a kind of a model to increase exports. An increase in exports suggests that we're seeing some kind of those application of policies which are very liberal, capitalist, Keynesian primarily, which expect a very tremendous transformation at the macro level in state spending, private ownership, and then coming down to the monetary structure where we see bonds and shares and funds developed. That has not been there. So Pakistan, India's economic model have been selectively pick and choose between micro, macro, socialist, and Keynesian structures, not a specific type of a model which would follow the textbook definition of whether it is a liberal Keynesian model, or is it a socialist model, or is it some kind of an indigenous model. We had very good works by Mehboob Haq and others who were suggesting these are the problems and we have to develop an indigenous model. Now that requires a huge amount of transformation, huge amount of policy structure, and various kinds of very stringent measures. Whether that was possible or whether that was done, anything close to that was done in Pakistan, we do not see that, but selectively. So currently, the type of structure we have is a selective use of Keynesian liberal economic model here, which is imposed by the IMF. India is in a better position to do that. China did that very well, especially after it came and joined WTO. It got foreign direct investment. It got huge amount of money, which it used to create sovereign wealth fund, something which mediates between the Communist Party, the state, and the private entrepreneurs. And they created huge amount of resources with which they created a very systematic bonds structure. So sovereign wealth funds was a combination of those foreign exchange reserves that they had, as well as foreign direct investment that they had, and huge amount of bond market they had. And they developed this transport and trade corridors, CPAC, and all of the others. So we're seeing a very systematic give and take between United States and China, and a very systematic elimination of that strategic competition, which 20 years ago was national missile defense, and you don't see that anymore. So we're seeing some kind of a possibility of Pakistan, China, and India developing their own some kind of models which would find a balance somewhere. Now, coming to specifically what can be done. In Pakistan's case, we're looking at how there is a very strong need to try to focus on how the circular debt can be addressed, how we can do something to reduce our external debt and try to reduce our spending below the economic growth in a way that Pakistan's exports can be enhanced. Now, what I'm trying to see and what I see as possible is that if we could find a balance between those years 47 to 1990 and try to adopt what we have now and inculcate that with what possibilities we have with regional economic integration, China, India, and possibility of trade with Iran. So yesterday we see Pakistan, Iran signing trade agreements. So what I think is a possibility is that if we see how village-based cottage industry can be focused upon, production is based on what is the need and necessity in those areas which are rural, which have a huge amount of labor-intensive potential, and where we can see something produced which is consumed in those places as well. I think developing countries such as Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, which have followed these models, have made this huge amount of turnover by focusing primarily on what was their potential. The reason why India has done better than us is that when I've been to India thrice and I saw a place called Gurgaon, which was the suburbs of daily. And it looked like a mini, I'd say, Dubai, surrounded by a pile of plastic waste and sewerage. But it was an absolute contradiction in terms. But what they have focused on was how there was this very systematic channelization of IT expansion and a huge amount of education of youth. So the thing that India exports now are these IT experts who go to United States, and now they are very systematically enhancing India's profile. Pakistan and India's difference is that they have focused more on educating and making their labor or power or their labor intensive potential rise to the level. Pakistan has not been able to do that. Obviously, we all know education needs to be funded more, but this is one of the problems. Anyway, so if I now like to conclude, I say I began by telling you what conflict transformation is. I'm saying transcending would imply that Pakistan looks at what is common in their economic model with India and China, develops their own model based on microeconomic, village-based, small industry, producing commodities which are sold there. Instead of children or young people who've got mobile phones and are not educated, they could produce things which are relevant to them, they could benefit from them, money could be produced, reinvested there, and then move to trading with regional countries, and then perhaps see the surplus created and then trade beyond the region. So that could be one possibility. Monetarily, Sukuk can be one area, like China has produced their bonds themselves. So Sukuk will be a good way, but the possibility will only be when you can make Sukuk compliant to the domestic debt, not trying to convert your interest-based banking system Sharia compliant. So finally, I've tried to show that, I've tried to say that transcending transformation in models and focusing on how China, India, and Iran can trade. Pakistan can produce something, another part can be produced in India. China can comply, can combine it and produce an exportable commodity and sell somewhere, so that this conflict between Pakistan and India does not hamper production, which can be collective. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ejaz. Some very interesting perspectives, especially on different models and comparing it with the regional countries. And finally, somebody did talk about cottage industries because it's less investment and more benefits, but I don't know why we have not been able to talk about it. But it's the win-win approach that is eventually going to work. Conflict management, we did try, but then it's a short-term thing and we have not been really, so the approach that we really need here is moving beyond conflict management. Conflict transformation is the surrounding, the events, the situations, the circumstances that are changing, bringing those changes in those circumstances that can actually have an impact in the policies. And now move to our final speaker, Ambassador Asif Durrani. Ambassador Asif Durrani has been ambassador to Iran and UAE, and currently he is a senior research fellow at IPRI. He's going to speak on regionalism, prospects of regional cooperation.
Thank you, Professor Shea. I'm grateful to Ambassador Nadeem Riaz for this opportunity to speak from this August forum. Well, I'll not give you any optimism as far as South Asia is concerned. Let's be realistic. So when we trace back the regionalism history, so it's comparatively a new phenomenon. After two devastating world wars, Europe realized the futility of wars, strived for common markets, harmonized their laws, and made their entire continent a single home. Consequently, through the US and NATO, Europe has successfully promoted its interests worldwide. That is the one aspect. On the contrary, colonial legacies have kept most developing countries entangled in border or ethnic disputes. South Asia is no exception. But there are success stories amongst the developing countries. ASEAN members put their disputes on the back burner and moved on. Consequently, the region has emerged as an Asian tiger. In South Asia, India is the largest and most resourceful country. Neighbors all the members of the SAARC except Afghanistan. However, unlike Indonesia and Malaysia, India failed to win the confidence of smaller neighbors. Its propensity to obfuscate core issues or sustain its occupation of territories has lost the trust of its neighbors. From the Indian perspective, smaller neighbors are vulnerable to external inducements which may go against Indian security and economic interests. Given the disputes with China and Pakistan, India has been wary of the two-front situation. Pakistan and the immediate neighbors of India have also faced pressures from the latter. Nepal faced frequent blockages whenever it adopted the independent course in its relations with China. Sri Lanka faced Tamil terrorism through Indian support. Bhutan is squeezed by India, while the Maldives, a tiny state, are indebted to India's goodwill. Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina has succumbed to Indian hegemony. So this is the situation as far as South Asia is concerned. Pakistan is the only country which has challenged the Indian hegemony in the region. India has tried to isolate Pakistan internationally and in the region. While internationally it failed to isolate Pakistan, it has tried to promote sub-regional groupings within South Asia to exclude Pakistan. From the regional security perspective, rivalry between India and Pakistan defines South Asia's security complex. This pattern of South Asian security dynamics has not changed, but with its rise, India's security interests have expanded beyond the confines of South Asia. India considers China a rival not only in the Indo-Pacific region, but also in South Asia. What about the India's approach towards the region? Since Pakistan is considered a rival in South Asia, India has embarked on a sub-regional approach. The first such collaborative sub-regionalism experimented with South Asia Growth Quadrangle in 1997, involving 4 SAARC nations, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal, to enhance quote-unquote regional solidarity and promoting overall development within SAARC, with an emphasis on project-based development. In 2000, India became a founding member of the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, BIMSTEC, involving South and Southeast Asian nations, including Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. In BIMSTEC, if you look at it, there are 5 SAARC countries which are members. Furthermore, it keeps geopolitical concerns at bay, as regional players such as China and Pakistan are not members of BIMSTEC. In the same year, 2000, India and South Africa launched the Indian Ocean Rim Association for Regional Cooperation, IOR-ARC, along with Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Yemen, Tanzania, Madagascar, and Mozambique. The IOR-ARC's primary objective was to promote sustainable growth and balanced development, economic cooperation for shared and mutual benefits, and remove impediments and lower barriers towards a freer and enhanced flow of goods, services, investments, and technology among the member states. As far as India's explanation of promoting sub-regional groupings are concerned, India thinks that the prospect for bilateral and regional cooperation among India's western border remains limited, with no signs of improving ties with its arch rival Pakistan. India blames Pakistan for opposing the SAARC Motor Vehicle Agreement and South Asia Satellite, hence its decision to go for the sub-regional groupings. And we have to support. As far as future prospects are concerned, there's no doubt that in South Asia, it is India which enjoys a central position because of its location. It borders all the members of SAARC except Afghanistan. There are estimates that India-Pakistan has the potential to raise their trade to $15 billion immediately. With a sustained level of trade, they can enhance the trade targets to $35 billion. But by the time being, it is a pipe dream. Already, India and Pakistan possess the necessary infrastructure to conduct their trade smoothly. With further improvement in the infrastructure, the two countries can become major trading partners. But it is not going to happen anytime soon. Despite tensions with China, the bilateral trade between China and India has increased from $90 billion in 2019 to $150 billion in 2022. Here, the Indian policy towards China is to appease, but towards Pakistan, it is to coerce. So the choice is ours. If India joins the CPEC, Pakistan can become a South and Central Asia transit hub with tremendous benefits to Pakistan through the transit fees. But this is not going to happen. And when we claim that we are a bridge between South Asia and Central Asia, if India is not part of the equation, then we are no more a bridge between South and Central Asia, because it is India which neighbors all the members of the South Asia. We are not. So we cannot become a bridge. So till the time you break the ice as far as political aspect is concerned between the two countries, I don't think we can, in fact, indulge in any kind of optimism about India or about the regional trade. Yes, on the Central Asian side, it is possible, provided Afghanistan is peaceful. But would Afghanistan remain peaceful? That is $1 million question. If Indians have already opened their mission in Kabul since June, despite the fact that we thought we were quite euphoric here, and our people thought that they have baptized the Taliban, but this has not happened. So Taliban are realists. I think they are pragmatists, and they think that which side of their bread is buttered, so they would not mind even eating from the Indian hands. So here lies the realistic approach, that how we put our house in order. As Muir Yusuf talked about the elite capture, it is very much. No one is going to invest in Pakistan, I can assure you. I have experienced that in UAE. When I would ask about the investment, they say, where is the local equity? And there was no local equity. You ask the Board of Investment, I invite you all to tell them which are the 10 projects which are ready for investment in the country. If you get the answer in 1 year, you think you are lucky. So we have, in fact, shot in our feet ourselves. And the elite capture is very much there. They would not allow it. This country is now governed by real estate mafia, sugar mafia, and other mafias. So unless you get rid of them, or unless you bring rule of law in this country, don't talk about regional cooperation or your prosperity, I think.
Thank you, Ambassador Saab. You have painted a bleak picture, but then this is the reality, unfortunately, that we live in. And interestingly, India doesn't care about the region, in the sense that a state alone cannot progress, even if your economic indicators are really doing well. If the rest of the countries are not doing well, then obviously it's sooner or later it's going to affect. With this, we conclude our session. But before the conclusion, we have a Q&A session, and I invite the participants to, ask the questions. You can identify yourself and point out the speaker also. Please try to be brief.
Dr. Ijaz Malik. First, on a very important topic, nations cannot have economic development unless they manage their conflicts. Now, in our region, and for Pakistan, we want to resolve our issues with India, how we manage this conflict. to avoid the connectivity problem that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Very, very broad question. Basically, one from the organizers of the Rejat Malik Saab, whose topic was about conflict management. And if we look at Pakistan and its relations with the neighboring countries, we see that both in terms of conflicts and economic development, our stakes, our context, they are more related and going beyond traditional what we call South Asia, which this seminar is about. Economic then they are with the South Asia. We have nothing to do as for economic relations are concerned with most countries of South Asia, with most countries of South Asia. When it comes, one out of the two hotspots is not in South Asia. Is it that there is a need to change whatever the 19th century concept of South Asia it was, when China was not British context or the British India? Is there a fundamental need to change that context, or we can continue to look at this South Asian paradigm and view our problems or stakes in the same context, which probably is no more relevant?
Hello. Hello. Is it okay now? Okay. I'm currently enrolled in International Relations, Bahauddin Zakria University. My question is from Wagner. He mentioned Afghanistan. As we know that South Asia has been plagued by the cross-border terrorism, and now the Taliban ruling in a Did you get the question, Dr. Wagner? Okay, so she's interested in knowing about the future of South Asia when now the Taliban are ruling Afghanistan and the rise in terrorism in the region as well. You can respond to the questions.
Thank you. Sorry, I have not fully understood the question. Well, I think security and the rise of terrorism is, of course, a major threat for all the, especially for the neighboring countries. So I think it, and this as far as I follow the developments in Pakistan, there are different efforts from the Pakistani government to deal with the Taliban in order to tackle the problem of the TTP. Of course, the international community should also be concerned because we also still have other militant groups in Afghanistan, like Al-Qaeda, like the Islamic State. So I think this will be an enormous challenge. It's of course also difficult because at the moment there is no recognition of the Taliban government. So we have an extremely limited leverage over Afghanistan, and we've seen the restrictions against women and their employment. So at the moment, I think one can only urge that the neighbors come together and find at least some form of cooperation in order to deal with the challenge. It's difficult because the militant groups in Afghanistan, they target different countries. The TTP, of course, targets Pakistan. The TTP has not an interest in Uzbekistan. And this, of course, makes it even more difficult. But we have seen this debate about the regional framework for Afghanistan already some 10 years ago. So I think it would be necessary that the neighboring countries which are most concerned should somehow cooperate in order to have a common approach vis-a-vis the Taliban in order to tackle with the different militant groups, whether they are targeting China, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, or other neighboring countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wagner.
I had said that Pakistan needs to focus on what was a good model which it followed, and that is the first part of my reply to the first question. You have to look inwards. So we can find a relative evolution from the period where we saw huge amount of economic growth in a way that poverty was alleviated, agricultural growth developed, huge amount of reinvestment in agricultural sector as well. That remains a reality. You can try to say that if we build a coal power structure in the heart of the most fertile province of Pakistan, Punjab, in Sahiwal, and ruin the place because we need coal, you can say that, but the reality is that there's a huge difference, huge divergence between how much coal we need and how much the people living in that very fertile part of Pakistan need from that land. So that is what I'm saying. The other thing I was saying was econometric side of it. So Sukuk bonds, if they are made in a manner that the domestic debt is made Sharia compliant, then Sukuk bonds can be useful. Why? Because China has such structures. If you talk about CPEC, then ultimately at some stage you'll have to collaborate with them in these type of monetary you can call them commodities or you can call them monetary interest-based bonds. So that is one thing which you do. Why can we not do that? Because land is a provincial subject and the federal structure cannot intervene there. If land is through a constitutional change made a federal subject, then Sukuk bonds will be connected with assets, and without that, they will have no credibility. The problem we cannot have interest-based bonds is that the bonds shared and bought and sold in West are not connected with material assets. That is a good place where we can capitalize and we can change in two areas. The production, industrialization, power generation, leading to industrialization, monetary structure, bond. If the value of the agricultural land is connected with Sukuk bond without looking at the risk of people who own land exploited, that their land could be held as collateral. But positive side of it is if there is production and then at the second stage you convert bonds to domestic debt and connect it with the asset, which is your land, you can set a base similar to what China has done. So I can't have advice for China. China has been doing very well without our advice. It's been very pragmatic. It has very systematically managed its confrontation with the United States. It has given them very strong monetary support. It has also basked while the sun is shining on the United States' dollar. And when their domestic financial structures and banks go bankrupt, then China brings in all of that money and bails them out. So I have a few skepticism about the possibility of an actual violent confrontation between United States and China, unless they do something in Taiwan. So a lesson learned by China is that if you see what happened in Ukraine, then United States is not going to very actively come to bail out the Ukrainians. So they may not come to bail out Taiwan. We can't say that. And China is wise enough to know that. I can't offer any advice for India. What I was saying was that in case we see transcending conflict helping us in any way formulate some kind of a trade policy, then if we can produce something which is, so if you look at the informal trade between Pakistan and China, which is not direct goods which we produce end up in China, in India, and the goods that they produce through various channels are brought to us, then there's a huge potential. Ambassador Saab said they can do that, but it's not likely. We can trade with India, but that's not likely. Interest, India will have their interest, China will have their interest, Pakistan will have their interest. If we are collaborating in CPEC, if India joins in, if China can very systematically, the way it has managed its economy and its profile and its confrontation with the United States, if we provide them something which they can use, what I've said earlier, then there is a chance that China creates some kind of a structure of economic integration where our confrontation with India will not matter, because China helps you produce something, you transport it to Chinese heartland, they help India produce something, it is transported in their heartland, and then it's converted into a exportable commodity and sold somewhere abroad, if that's a possibility. Whether China can be a part of South Asia or something, when China was not seen as a member of South Asia, there has been a huge discourse about Pakistan actually historically, culturally, traditionally more affiliated with Afghanistan and the Central Asian STAN states, as they call them. Possibility, yes, but then without Afghanistan, that is not possible. We can't pass through Afghanistan, and how can you talk about going to Central Asian states if what I'm saying can be done, because India has monetary influence and financial economic interest and possibilities of collaboration with Afghanistan, so with Iran, so does China with Afghanistan and Iran. If some kind of structure for domestic production, which will be in demand in such regional economies, can be done and can be mediated through China, then possible. So I don't have advice for China or India. I have advice for us. Look at what they have done and see what we can do within whatever we have as the bureaucratic red tape and all of the other things.
Thank you, Dr. Ijaz. And I think we don't have any more questions. With this, we conclude this session. Just to sum up, although our panelists have very comprehensively discussed all the aspects, but I would say that it is time to prioritize a human security paradigm in order to mitigate the emerging threats to stability in the region. The UN actually provides 7 dimensions of human security, and we are going to have in the different sessions here on some of the aspects for economy, environmental side, food, health, political, personal, and community. And when it comes to human security approach, which is, as we have talked about, it's people-centered, it considered broad range of conditions that threatens survival and livelihood and dignity of people. Prevention is the core of, is the core objective of human security, which is strengthening local capacities to build resilience, which is strengthen and enhance social cohesion. So everything is linked with the other things. So we talk about social cohesion, but when, we have the capacity for a resilient society, and how do we do that? It is when we invest in human security. As the basic assumption is, when a human faces a threat, so does the international security. So the question is, security from what? And what threat are we talking about? So one can argue that absence of any of those 7 dimensions that I have just mentioned, they constitute a localized threat, which follows a more widespread global threat to human security. What is required is to view the security from a different lens. Prioritizing and redefining the security is worth exploring. That will lead to sustainable peace. The onus is far more on the countries to work on both approaches of security, both traditional and non-traditional, through mutual collaboration. With that, I thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists and our chair for such an insightful discussion. Before we move on to the next session, we do have tokens of appreciation for our panelists and our chair. Thank you so much. Our next and last session for today is traditional security concerns in South Asia. Our session chair will be Ambassador Jalil Abbas Jalani, who is a former Foreign Secretary, Dr. Yelena Bieberman, who